Hi guys, here we are back again with the OCR specification, and in this particular video I am jumping ahead a little bit in the spec and I'm jumping ahead to the market failure section. And the reason is that in previous videos I said that I had already created content about price controls. However, having looked myself in the playlist, I cannot find them. And so here today we're going to at least plug one of those gaps. So what am I looking at today? I'm looking at the whole notion of price controls, specifically the whole notion of a maximum price or a price ceiling, as you may more commonly refer to it as. So let's get straight to the criterion from the spec as follows. Explain. So again, that whole notion of a scratch the surface understanding and explanation. With the aid of a diagram, here's the diagram, how government intervention, so this is an intervention by the government to correct a problem in the economy, corrects or reduces market failure, for example. Now in the spec it gives you a whole host of examples that you need to be aware of. Indirect taxes, subsidies, the list is endless. But today, as I say, we're focusing on this one, which is the whole notion of price controls. So we're looking today specifically, just to clarify, at the whole notion of a guaranteed maximum price, aka a price ceiling or a price cap. Now, given that your synoptic paper is, of course, could be combining the micro and the macro elements together, and given that you're often tasked with looking at the housing market, so maybe the whole notion of a maximum rent or a rent control or a ceiling on rental prices is something that this could be applied to, so something for you to consider. There's a tremendous article actually in the Economics Today magazine for those of you who subscribe. There's a tremendous article in the last edition. So various examples. It's very prevalent at the moment actually, this notion of holding prices down and not letting them shoot out of control and beyond the reach of various members of society. So maximum rents we've mentioned. You could also think about the whole notion of a maximum wage. I do have a video on maximum wage theory, and that's really being applied to CEOs of big companies and whether or not they should be receiving many hundreds of times what their lowest paid employee receives. Should there be a maximum wage imposed? How much is anybody really worth after all? And then finally, energy prices, of course. That whole scenario with regard to introducing a cap on utility bills. So it's quite prevalent and therefore obviously ripe for question and examination assessment in the summer. So let's get to the diagram. The diagram is thus, straightforward, demand curve, supply curve, and here we have our equilibrium. Here we have the maximum price. Now for the maximum price to be effective, it has to be introduced, of course, below the equilibrium, which this red line, of course, is. So there's your equilibrium, there's the maximum price below it. Now, why would it not be effective? And this is a very common, actually, ladies and gentlemen, multiple choice question, where you're presented with a diagram like this, and asked, well, what would happen if a maximum price was imposed above the equilibrium? Well, of course, if you already had equilibrium, so demand meeting supply, the needs of the consumer matching the desires of the supplier, then the price will be P star. And so if you introduced a maximum price above P star, it wouldn't have any impact on the price. Very common multi-choice style question, usually intended to try and trip you up. But be smarter than the average bear, ladies and gentlemen, and just be prepared for something like that. So, what happens when we introduce a maximum price below the equilibrium? Well, a nice piece of analysis and very straightforward, ladies and gents. Here we have our supply curve. So the supply is obviously here. So that's S max. Okay, and then demand is here. And there's our D max. So we can quite clearly see, ladies and gentlemen, that in this instance, D is greater than S. So there's more demand than supply in this particular instance. And of course, you'll be familiar, having, I hope, watched my previous videos, that we're putting this particular market, be it one of these or others, we're putting this into a disequilibrium position because demand does not equal supply, demand is indeed greater than supply. So, as a consequence, wherever you introduce this type of policy, you're going to have a scenario whereby the suppliers here, because they're not actually receiving enough money to supply this amount of demand, because actually to meet this amount of demand, how much would they need? They'd need that price. So if they were being given that price, they would be able to match that demand, but they're not. And so as a consequence, you get, of course, demand greater than supply, aka a shortage in the market. And that would only be exacerbated by things such as economic growth, where incomes went up and the demand curve would probably then shift to the right, and so the distance between the S max and the D max would get even bigger. I'll not annotate that on this diagram. You're clever enough to do that yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, but shift your demand curve to the right and you'll have another intersection then for demand over here, and so the distance between the supply and the demand will get bigger. Now, what will happen, ladies and gentlemen, if there is a shortage? And this is the sort of, I suppose, the more important application here. If there's a shortage, there will of course be people in the economy willing to pay more than P max for this quantity supplied. And where are those people? Well, we would just need to take a line up from S max through this point and all the way up to the demand curve. And remember, the demand curve shows us our willingness to pay. And so there are a group of people who might be willing then to pay that price, this much higher price. Now, why would they be willing to do that? Well, they'd be willing to do that because this is in shortage and scarce, and the introduction of a maximum price often creates black markets whereby people go about acquiring this shortage product by being willing to pay a much higher price for it. And the higher price they'd be willing to pay is P, so if we call this PBM, this would be the price at the black market price, in effect. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so that's really all I'm going to say on this particular diagram. So it's an interesting one, and of course you then need to consider this further, and I'll try and do this in future videos, as to what would the implications be, and really how probable is it that the introduction of a maximum price would be effective in markets such as these. However, I'll leave it there. Bye for now.